Most of what you've heard about existentialism is wrong, or at least incomplete. It's not French. It's not from the 20th century. The people we file under it mostly hated each other's ideas, and several of them would have rejected the label outright. Black turtlenecks, smoky cafes, Sartre and Camus arguing in Paris. That's about 10 years of a much longer story. The actual story starts roughly 4,000 years earlier, on clay tablets, with a king who watches his best friend die and decides that's not acceptable. What follows is that story. We'll spend time with the Mesopotamian who hunted for the plant of eternal life and lost it to a snake, a Hebrew poet who concluded everything is vapor and recommended we eat our bread anyway, a Greek who drank poison rather than stop asking questions, a Danish hunchback who thought faith was a kind of madness, a German with a mustache who agreed but went the other way, declared God dead, and ended his life embracing a horse in the street, a Russian novelist who proved that a free person will gladly choose his own ruin just to prove he's free, and eventually the Parisians who took all of it, lit a cigarette, and gave it a name. You don't need a philosophy degree for any of this. You need an hour and a reasonable tolerance for being told that the universe has nothing to say about why you're here. In exchange, you'll get something close to a 4,000-year letter, written by people trying to answer the question you carry around without quite admitting it. What to do with a life nobody handed you the instructions for. The History of Existentialism, a long walk through the maze of self. Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the edge of a vast, dark forest. The trees are impossibly old, their branches tangled in a canopy that blocks out the certainty of the stars. Somewhere in the distance you hear the howl of a wolf, or perhaps it is just the wind playing tricks on a mind that is suddenly, acutely aware of how alone it is. You do not have a map. You are not given a compass. You are simply here, and you have to figure out what to do next. That shiver running down your spine, the one mixed equally with terror and a strange electric sense of possibility, that is the starting gun of existentialism. We often use the word existentialism like a heavy velvet curtain in an old theater. We know it signals something serious, something French, probably involving black turtlenecks and cigarettes, maybe a basement jazz club where everyone looks vaguely haunted. But if we strip away the academic jargon and the cliches, we find that existentialism is not just a philosophy for professors or poets. It is the most practical, urgent, and deeply human question there is. How do I live a meaningful life in a world that offers no clear instructions? Here's the surprise that most textbooks and introductory lectures fail to deliver with any real force. This question was not invented in a Parisian café in 1945. It is ancient. It is buried in the bedrock of our earliest stories. It has been gnawing at the edges of the human mind for as long as we have been telling stories around fires, carving images into stone, and burying our dead with objects they might need in an uncertain beyond. Long before anyone knew the word existentialism, a word that would not be coined until the 20th century and would be rejected by many of the very thinkers it claimed to describe, people were writing about the dread of death, the search for purpose, the weight of choice, and the terrifying freedom of being alive. This essay is an invitation to walk that long path through history, to meet the kings, the scribes, the believers, and the rebels who dared to ask, what does it mean to exist? And more than that, it is an invitation to see yourself in their ancient, echoing struggles. The first existentialist, the man who wanted to live forever, to find the earliest footprint of existential thought, the first time a human being looked at the sky and demanded an answer from the silence, we have to travel back nearly 4,000 years. We go not to Greece, not to Jerusalem, but to the mud brick walls of ancient Mesopotamia, to the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And there we find a story pressed into clay tablets, a story that has survived the collapse of empires and the erosion of millennia, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is often called the oldest story ever written down, and it is, at its core, a sustained panic attack about death. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, is a figure of immense power. He is described as two-thirds God and one-third man, a formula that suggests he is more than human but not quite divine, a creature caught between worlds. He is a tornado of ego and strength. He builds great walls around his city, walls so massive that their foundations will be spoken of for ages. He fights monsters. He beds the brides of his subjects before their husbands can. He believes himself untouchable, beyond the reach of any consequence, a force of nature rather than a mortal being. And then Enkidu arrives. Enkidu is a wild man, formed from clay by the gods to be Gilgamesh's equal and his counterweight. He lives among the animals, running with the gazelles, until he is civilized through an encounter with a temple priestess. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu finally meet, they fight to a standstill, and then, in a turn that reveals something profound about the human need for recognition, they become the deepest of friends. They become, in essence, two halves of a single soul. Together, they journey to the cedar forest to slay the demon Humbaba. Together, they defy the goddess Ishtar and slay the bull of heaven sent to punish them. But the gods are watching, and the gods are fickle. They decree that one of the two friends must die for their arrogance. The lot falls to Enkidu, and here, in the death of the wild man, the existential crisis of the story erupts with volcanic force. Gilgamesh does not simply mourn, he unravels. He sits by Enkidu's body for 7 days and 7 nights, waiting for him to rise, refusing to accept the reality of the corpse. When a worm falls from Enkidu's nostril, Gilgamesh finally understands. This is what death is. This is what awaits him. The great king, the builder of walls, the slayer of monsters, the two-thirds divine, is reduced to a terrified animal staring into an abyss he cannot bridge. He cries out words that have echoed through every human heart that has ever lost someone. I am afraid of death. And so he flees. He abandons his city, his throne, his duties. He puts on the skin of a lion and wanders the wilderness, a king turned vagabond, searching for the one thing he cannot have, immortality. He seeks out Utnapishtim, the only human ever granted eternal life by the gods, a man who survived the great flood that destroyed the world. To reach him, Gilgamesh must cross the waters of death, a journey that symbolizes the passage from the world of the living to the realm of what lies beyond. When he finally reaches Utnapishtim, the flood survivor tells him a truth that is as brutal as it is simple. There is no permanence. Do we build a house to stand forever? Do we seal a contract to hold for all time? From the days of old, there is no permanence. The sleeping and the dead, how alike they are. They are like a painted death. But Utnapishtim offers a test. If Gilgamesh can stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, perhaps he can conquer death. Gilgamesh, exhausted and human, falls asleep immediately. When he wakes, Utnapishtim's wife takes pity on him and tells him of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that restores youth. Gilgamesh ties stones to his feet, plunges into the deep, and retrieves it. He has it in his hands. He has beaten death. He will take it back to Uruk and share it with the elders. But on the journey home, he stops to bathe in a cool pool of water. A snake slithers up from the depths, smells the fragrance of the plant of youth, and steals it away, shedding its skin as it disappears into the reeds. Gilgamesh sits down and weeps. The quest has failed. He will die. He returns to Uruk empty-handed, forced to accept the one thing he cannot conquer, the finitude of his own being. And yet, as he approaches the city gates, something shifts. He looks at the massive walls he built, the walls that surround Uruk, and he says to the ferryman who accompanied him, he tells Urshanabi to climb the walls of Uruk and pace their length, to examine the foundation, to study how the bricks were fired, to bear witness that the 7 sages themselves must have laid this groundwork. This is not the triumphant return of a hero who has won immortality. It is something quieter and, in its way, more profound. It is the realization that we live on not in our bodies, but in what we leave behind, our works, our walls, our stories. The epic does not end with eternal life. It ends with a man looking at his city and understanding that the only answer to death is to build something worth remembering, to love someone worth mourning, to live a life that leaves a mark, however faint, on the walls of time. This is the first recorded instance of what we might call the absurd confrontation, the collision between our human desire for permanence and the reality of our decay. Gilgamesh is every one of us. We all build walls against the night. We all lose the plant to the snake, and we all must find a way to go on living anyway. The existential question is already fully formed here, in clay, 4 millennia before Sartre picked up a pen. The Hebrew poet and the wind chaser. 1,000 years or so after Gilgamesh, give or take a few centuries, another voice emerged from the ancient Near East. This time it came from the land of Canaan, from a people who had known slavery in Egypt, wandering in the desert, and the fragile glory of a kingdom that would soon split and fall. The voice is preserved in the pages of what we call the Book of Ecclesiastes. Tradition attributes it to King Solomon, the wisest man in the world, the son of David, a ruler who had everything a human being could desire: wealth beyond measure, 700 wives and 300 concubines, a palace of cedar and gold, and a reputation for wisdom that drew visitors from distant lands. But the speaker of Ecclesiastes is not the confident Solomon of proverbs and temple dedications. He calls himself only by his title, Qohelet, the teacher, or perhaps the assembler, the one who gathers people to listen. And what he has to say is not a sermon of triumphant faith. It is a confession of profound, bone-deep disillusionment. If you have ever felt that life is a hamster wheel of endless striving that leads nowhere, that you are running on a treadmill and the scenery never changes, you will recognize Qohelet as a kindred spirit. Vanity of vanities, he cries at the very beginning of his discourse. All is vanity. But the English word vanity is a weak translation. It conjures images of a person staring into a mirror, admiring their own reflection. The Hebrew word is hevel. It means vapor, breath, smoke, mist. It is the exhalation you see on a cold winter morning, visible, tangible for a moment, and then gone, dissipated into the vast, uncaring air. Life, Qohelet is saying, is hevel. It is a breath on a cold morning. You see it, you feel it, and then it is gone. And everything we chase after, pleasure, wisdom, power, legacy, is equally vaporous. Qohelet embarks on a grand experiment, and he records the results with the clinical detachment of a scientist who is also the subject of his own study. He does not argue from abstract principles, he reports from lived experience. I said in my heart, "Come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself." But behold, this also was hevel. He raised houses and put in vineyards. He laid out parks and gardens stocked with every kind of fruit tree and dug pools to water the growing groves. He bought slaves, men and women, and counted as his own the ones born under his roof. His cattle and flocks outnumbered anything Jerusalem had seen before him. He hoarded the silver and gold of kings, the treasure of whole provinces. He kept singers of both sexes, and the harem that was the standard glory of an ancient ruler. And what was the verdict? Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was hevel and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. This phrase, under the sun, is crucial. Qohelet deliberately limits his perspective. He is not looking to heaven for answers. He is looking at the world as it is, here and now, in the realm where the sun rises and sets, where people are born and die, where the rivers run to the sea, but the sea is never full. He is doing philosophy from the ground up, from the evidence of his own eyes and his own aching heart. He observes the cycles of nature and finds no comfort in them. One generation leaves and another arrives, while the earth stays put through all of it. The sun climbs and sets and rushes back to climb again. The wind blows south, then circles to the north, around and around, always returning along the path it just left. This is not the harmonious, reassuring order that later philosophers would celebrate. It is a grinding, repetitive mechanism that pays no attention to the individual human life that flares and vanishes within it. The world goes on. It does not care. He looks at wisdom and finds that it only increases sorrow. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. He looks at justice and sees that the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer. In the place of justice there is wickedness. In the place of righteousness there is wickedness. He looks at human labor and sees that everything we build will be inherited by someone who did not work for it, someone who might be a fool. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. And then he arrives at the most devastating observation of all, the one that ties him directly to the existentialist tradition. In the 3rd chapter, he writes the famous lines that have been set to music and read at countless funerals. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted. But he does not stop there, he continues. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. This is the existential condition in a single sentence. God has placed eternity in the human heart, a longing for permanence, for meaning that transcends death, for an answer to the question, why? But he has also placed a limit on our understanding. We cannot see the full picture. We are creatures of hevel, of vapor, trying to grasp the eternal. This is the tension that 20th century existentialists like Albert Camus would feel in their bones and call the absurd, the divorce between the human cry for meaning and the world's silent, beautiful, terrifying refusal to answer. And yet, despite all this, Qohelet does not counsel despair. He does not tell us to curse God and die, as Job's wife advised. He does not advocate suicide, though he acknowledges that the dead are better off than the living, and better than both is the one who has never been born. Instead, he offers a strange, quiet, almost subversive counsel. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. He repeats this refrain throughout the book. Eat, drink, enjoy your work, love your wife, wear white garments, let your head lack no oil. Enjoy the small, fleeting, hevel-like pleasures of the day. This is not a shallow hedonism, a eat, drink, and be merry for tomorrow we die, that ignores the darkness. It is a response to the darkness. Because life is vapor, because the big picture is smoke, the only real thing left is the small, warm fire in front of you, the taste of bread, the warmth of a lover's hand, the satisfaction of a task completed. Qohelet does not deny the existence of God. His God is real and present, but his God is distant and silent, a mystery that cannot be solved by human reason. The proper response, Qohelet concludes, is not to solve the mystery, but to fear God and keep his commandments, and to embrace the small good things that life, in its fleetingness, still offers. This is existentialism with a theistic frame. It is the recognition that meaning is not found in grand, cosmic answers, but in the lived texture of daily existence. Long before Camus imagined Sisyphus happy, Qohelet imagined the wise man eating his bread with joy. The Greek turn. Know thyself and face the abyss. The Greeks get a great deal of credit for inventing philosophy, and rightly so. They gave us the word itself, philosophia, the love of wisdom, and they created the structures of logical inquiry that would shape Western thought for 2.5 millennia. But if we look closely at the Greek tradition, we find not one, but 2 streams of thought, and one of them flows directly into the river of existentialism. The dominant stream, the one taught in introductory philosophy courses, runs from Plato through Aristotle to the systematizers and the schoolmen. Plato looked at the world of change, decay, and imperfection, the world where beautiful things fade and just actions are punished, and he decided that this world could not be the real one. The real world, he argued, is a realm of perfect, eternal, unchanging forms. The chair you sit on is a flawed, temporary copy of the ideal chair. The justice you strive for is a shadow of the form of justice. Our task as humans is to turn away from the flickering shadows on the cave wall and climb toward the light of the forms, to contemplate the eternal and align our souls with it. This is a powerful and seductive vision. It promises that the chaos of life has an underlying order, that our suffering has a purpose, that there is a true home for the soul beyond this veil of tears. But it also, in a subtle way, devalues the very thing that existentialism would later place at the center: the individual, concrete, existing human being. In Plato's scheme, what matters is not your particular life, with its specific joys and sorrows, but the universal essence of humanity that you participate in. You are valuable insofar as you approximate the form. But there was another stream in Greek thought, one that kept its eyes stubbornly on the ground. It is the stream that runs from Socrates, not the Socrates of Plato's later, more mystical dialogues, but the Socrates of the marketplace, the Socrates of the early dialogues, the Socrates who claimed to know nothing except that he knew nothing. Socrates did not write books about the cosmos. He did not construct elaborate metaphysical systems. He walked around Athens in sandals, or often barefoot, it is said, and he asked people questions. He would stop a prominent citizen, a self-proclaimed expert on virtue or justice, and he would ask, with feigned innocence, "What is courage?" The citizen would offer a definition. Socrates would ask a follow-up question. The definition would crumble. The citizen would grow frustrated, then angry, then humiliated. But Socrates was not trying to humiliate for sport. He was trying to demonstrate something essential: that we do not know ourselves as well as we think we do. His whole mission was summed up in two words carved on the temple of Apollo at Delphi: know thyself. For Socrates, the unexamined life was not worth living. This is not a call to navel-gazing self-absorption. It is a radical demand to take responsibility for your own existence. You cannot simply inherit your beliefs from your parents or your city. You cannot simply do what everyone else does because everyone else does it. You must turn your gaze inward and ask, what do I actually believe? Why do I believe it? What am I doing with this one life I have? This is existentialism in its embryonic form. Socrates was essentially saying that you exist first, and then you must define yourself through your choices. He did not offer a set of answers. He offered a method of questioning, and he was so committed to this method, to this way of life, that he was willing to die for it. The story of Socrates' death, as told by Plato in the Apology and the Phaedo, is one of the foundational documents of the existential attitude. Charged with impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens, Socrates was brought to trial. He could have groveled, offered a plea bargain, promised to stop philosophizing. He could have escaped from prison, as his friends urged him to do. Instead, he defended himself with a kind of serene defiance. He told the jury that he would rather die than stop asking questions, because the unexamined life was not worth living. He said that death was either a dreamless sleep, which is no great evil, or a journey to another place where he could continue his questioning among the heroes of the past. And then, after being condemned, he drank the hemlock. According to the account in the Phaedo, he spent his last hours discussing philosophy with his friends, calm and composed. He reminded them that they owed a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, a cryptic final remark that has been debated for centuries. Perhaps he meant that death was a cure for the sickness of life. Perhaps it was a simple, mundane instruction, a refusal to let even the moment of death become a grand, solemn drama. Whatever he meant, Socrates demonstrated something that every existentialist would later affirm: that a person can face annihilation with integrity, not because they know what comes next, but because they know who they are at that moment. He showed that the act of choosing, even choosing death, is what constitutes a self. He did not find meaning in a cosmic plan or a promise of reward. He found meaning in the act of living according to his own examined principles, right up to the final breath. After Socrates, the Greek world changed. The city-state of Athens fell from its heights. The conquests of Alexander the Great created a vast cosmopolitan empire where the old, local sources of meaning, the tribe, the city, the ancestral gods, no longer provided the same security. People found themselves adrift in a large, impersonal world. And in response, new philosophies emerged, philosophies that were not about understanding the cosmos, but about surviving it with dignity. The Stoics and Epicureans continued the work of the self that Socrates had begun. They looked at a world full of political chaos, disease, sudden misfortune, and the ever-present reality of death, and they asked a very practical question: what is actually in my control? Their answer was stark and uncompromising. The only things truly in your control are your own judgments, your own choices, your own character. Everything else, your wealth, your reputation, your health, the loyalty of your friends, the weather, the outcome of your efforts, is on loan from a universe that can call it back at any moment without notice or explanation. Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher who had been born a slave and walked with a limp from a leg that had been broken by his master, put it this way: it is not things themselves that trouble people, but their judgments about things. Death, for instance, is nothing terrible. If it were, it would have appeared so to Socrates. But the terror consists in our notion of death, that it is terrible. The task of the philosopher, in this view, is to train the mind to see things as they are, not as we fear them to be. We must learn to say to every difficult circumstance, "You are an external thing, and not in my control. You cannot touch my inner citadel." Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who wrote his private journal, now known as the Meditations, while camped on the cold frontiers of the empire, facing barbarian invasions and the treachery of his own generals, echoed the same theme. "You have power over your mind," he wrote to himself, "not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And he faced the existential reality of our smallness with a clarity that anticipates Pascal. Consider the universe, matter, how small a part of it; time, how brief a span allotted to you; fate, how tiny a thread in the vast web. This is a radical acceptance of the precarious position humans are in. It is not a denial of suffering, but a strategy for bearing it. It is the recognition that we cannot control the world, but we can control our response to it. And in that small, inviolable space of inner freedom, we can find a dignity that no external power can take away. As the 17th century thinker Blaise Pascal would later put it, in a passage that reads like a summary of the existential predicament, Pascal's image is of the human as a reed, nature's most fragile thing, but a reed that thinks. The cosmos doesn't need to bring its full weight against us. A puff of vapor or a drop of water is enough. And yet, even as it destroys us, we hold something the universe doesn't. We know we are being destroyed, and we know what is doing it. The universe, for all its size, has no idea. The universe, vast and mindless, will crush us without even noticing. But in that knowing, that consciousness of the abyss, lies our dignity. The dark night of the soul, Christian existentialism before the name. The rise of Christianity introduced a new element into the existential equation. For 1,000 years, from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, the dominant framework for understanding human existence was provided by the Church, and at first glance, Christianity seems to solve the existential problem rather than deepen it. If you believe in an all-powerful, all-loving God who created you for a purpose, who watches over every sparrow and counts every hair on your head, and who promises eternal life to the faithful, then the anxiety of meaninglessness would seem to be cured. There is a map. There is a compass. The forest is not dark. It is lit by the light of revelation. But the existential question did not disappear. It simply went underground, emerging in the writings of mystics and monks who found that even faith did not provide a permanent shield against doubt, dread, and the feeling of divine absence. The tradition of the dark night of the soul, articulated most famously by the 16th century Spanish mystic Saint John of the Cross, describes a period of spiritual desolation in which God seems to withdraw entirely. The believer prays and hears only silence. The consolations of faith dry up. The soul is left alone in a desert of uncertainty. This is not the same as atheistic despair. St. John of the Cross believed that the dark night was a form of purification, a way of stripping away attachment to spiritual feelings so that the soul could cling to God alone, without the comfort of sensory or emotional reassurance. But the experience he describes is existentially identical to the crisis of meaninglessness that Sartre or Camus would later analyze. It is the felt absence of any transcendent support. It is the demand to keep walking even when you cannot see the path. A more dramatic example comes from the life of Martin Luther, the 16th century German monk who sparked the Protestant Reformation. Luther was, by his own account, a man tormented by what he called Anfechtung, a word that can be translated as temptation, but carries the weight of spiritual assault, doubt, and despair. He felt the weight of his own sinfulness as a crushing burden. He performed the rituals of the church with obsessive scrupulosity, confessing his sins for hours on end, but he could not find peace. He felt that God was not a loving father, but a stern judge, and that he, Luther, was damned. His breakthrough came not from a rational argument, but from a kind of existential leap. He was reading St. Paul's epistle to the Romans when a phrase struck him: "The just shall live by faith." Luther realized, in a flash of insight that felt like being born again, that salvation was not something he could earn through his own efforts. It was a gift, freely given by God's grace, to be received by faith. He could not make himself righteous. He could only trust that God had declared him righteous, despite all evidence to the contrary. This is, in a profound way, a precursor to Kierkegaard's leap of faith. Luther looked at the abyss of his own unworthiness and the silence of a hidden God, and he chose to believe anyway. He chose to trust in a promise he could not verify. This is not a comfortable, complacent faith. It is a faith that exists in the teeth of doubt, a faith that has stared into the void and decided, against all reason, to call it grace. The Melancholy Dane, Kierkegaard, and the Leap of Faith. Now we arrive at the figure who is, by wide consensus, the true father of modern existentialism. Fast forward through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, past the confident declarations of the Enlightenment that reason would solve everything, past the towering system of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who claimed to have explained all of history and reality in a neat, logical machine. We arrive in the 19th century, in the city of Copenhagen, Denmark, and we meet a man whose spine was curved like a question mark and whose mind was on fire, Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is not an easy figure to introduce. He wrote in Danish, a language spoken by few outside his small northern kingdom. He published many of his works under strange pseudonyms: Johannes de Silentio, Constantine Constantius, Vigilius Haufniensis, Anticlimacus, creating a cast of characters who debated each other across the pages of his books. He was a deeply religious man, a Christian, but he was also a fierce critic of the comfortable, bourgeois Christianity of his day, which he saw as a betrayal of the radical demands of the gospel. He was, by all accounts, a difficult person, brilliant, witty, melancholic, prone to feuds, and haunted by a sense of a secret curse that hung over his family. He looked at the grand philosophical system of Hegel, which was the reigning orthodoxy in European universities. Hegel had built a magnificent intellectual edifice, a system that explained the movement of spirit through history, the unfolding of absolute knowledge. It was a system that subsumed everything: art, religion, politics, the individual human life, into a vast, rational process. And Kierkegaard laughed. Or rather, he wrote with a kind of savage irony. He said, in essence, "You have built a magnificent palace of ideas, a system of perfect logical coherence, but you have forgotten one small thing. I don't live in the palace. I live in the tool shed out back." The system might explain the universe, But it did not tell Søren Kierkegaard, this particular, concrete, existing individual with a bad back and a broken engagement and a fear of his own father, how to live on a Tuesday morning. Kierkegaard was the first to use the word existence in this new, special, emphatic way. For him, existence is not just being there. A rock exists, a cow exists, a character in a novel exists, but a human being exists in a different sense. True existence is the passionate, subjective, terrifying process of becoming an individual. It is not a state, it is a task. You are not born a self, you must become one. And the process of becoming is marked by anxiety, despair, and the absolute necessity of choice. He wrote about anxiety, but not the kind of nervousness you feel before a job interview or a first date. He wrote about what he called the dizziness of freedom. Imagine standing on the edge of a high cliff, looking down into the churning sea below. You are not being pushed. There is no force compelling you to jump, but you feel a strange, vertiginous pull, a nausea of possibility. You could jump. Nothing is stopping you. The freedom itself becomes a kind of terror. This is anxiety for Kierkegaard, the awareness that you are free, that you could do anything, that you are not determined by your past or your biology or your social role, and that you must choose. And in choosing, you create yourself. And no one can choose for you. No system of philosophy, no political ideology, no scientific law, no advice from a friend can take away the burden of that choice. He wrote about despair as the sickness unto death. Despair, for Kierkegaard, is not just feeling sad. It is the condition of not wanting to be yourself. He identified several forms of this sickness. There is the despair of not being conscious of having a self, the person who simply drifts through life, conforming to what others expect, never realizing that there is an I that must be chosen and owned. There is the despair of not wanting to be oneself, the person who wishes they were someone else, more talented, more beautiful, more lucky. And there is the deepest form, the despair of willing to be oneself, but in defiance of the power that established the self. The person who shakes their fist at God and says, I will be myself on my own terms, even if it means damnation. For Kierkegaard, the only cure for this despair is to move through what he called the 3 stages on life's way, or spheres of existence. The first is the aesthetic stage. This is the life of the pleasure seeker, the connoisseur of experiences. The aesthete lives for the moment, chasing sensation, avoiding commitment. Kierkegaard's great portrait of the aesthete is the character of A in Either/Or, and most famously, the seducer Johannes in The Seducer's Diary. The aesthete's life is a series of intense but disconnected moments, like a string of pearls without a string. But the problem, Kierkegaard shows, is that the aesthete eventually becomes bored. The pleasures repeat, the intensity fades, and boredom, for Kierkegaard, is not a minor annoyance. It is the root of all evil, a sign of the emptiness at the core of a life lived without commitment. The second stage is the ethical stage. This is the life of duty, responsibility, and commitment. The ethical person makes choices and sticks to them. He marries, takes a job, becomes a citizen, fulfills his obligations. Kierkegaard's portrait of the ethical life is Judge William, also from Either/Or. The judge argues that the ethical life is higher than the aesthetic because it gives life continuity and meaning. But the ethical stage also has its limit. The judge, for all his virtue, is still living by the general rules of society. He has not yet confronted the absolute demand of the individual before God. And that brings us to the third stage, the religious stage. This is the life of faith. And for Kierkegaard, faith is not a comfortable belief in a set of doctrines. It is a leap into the absurd. His great example is Abraham, the patriarch who was commanded by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. Kierkegaard wrote a whole book about this story, Fear and Trembling, under the pseudonym Johannes de Silentio. Think about the story from Abraham's perspective. He has waited his whole life for a son, the son of the promise, the son through whom God has said he will become the father of many nations. And then God commands him to take that son to Mount Moriah and kill him as a burnt offering. Ethically, this is murder. It is the violation of the most fundamental human bond. If Abraham were an ethical hero, a tragic figure, he would refuse. He would say, "I cannot, it would be wrong." But Abraham does not refuse. He takes Isaac, he travels for 3 days, he binds him to the altar, he raises the knife. What does Abraham have to justify this? Nothing. He cannot explain it to Sarah, his wife. He cannot explain it to Isaac. He cannot explain it to himself. He has no rational argument, no ethical principle, no assurance of a happy ending. He has only the absurd belief that God, who gave him the Son, can give him back again, even from the dead. This is the teleological suspension of the ethical, the idea that the individual's absolute relation to the absolute God can supersede the universal demands of ethics. It is a terrifying idea, and Kierkegaard does not pretend otherwise. He calls Abraham a knight of faith, and he admits that he himself cannot make the movement of faith. He can only admire it from a distance, with fear and trembling. The lesson Kierkegaard draws is not that we should all go out and prepare to sacrifice our children. It is that faith, true faith, is not a comfortable inheritance. It is a passionate, personal, existential commitment that goes beyond evidence and logic. It is a leap in the dark, and it is the only way, he believed, to become a true self before God. The Mad Prophet, Nietzsche, and the Death of God. If Kierkegaard was the anxious, praying poet of existentialism, writing in the quiet of his Copenhagen apartment, Friedrich Nietzsche was its lightning bolt, striking from the mountains of Switzerland and Italy. Writing in the late 19th century with a hammer in one hand and a lyre in the other, he subtitled one of his books, How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Nietzsche made the most famous and most misunderstood statement in modern thought: God is dead. We must be careful here. Nietzsche did not say this as a triumphant atheist slogan, a bumper sticker for secular humanism. He put the words in the mouth of a madman who runs into the marketplace in the bright morning hours carrying a lantern and cries out, "I seek God, I seek God." The people in the marketplace, the modern, enlightened, secular citizens, laugh at him. They say, "Did God get lost? Did he go on a voyage? Is he hiding?" And the madman looks at them and says, "Where is God? I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers." This is not a celebration. It is a diagnosis and a warning. Nietzsche saw that the foundation of Western morality and meaning, the belief in a divine order that guaranteed the value of truth, goodness, and human dignity, was crumbling under the weight of science, historical criticism, and the general drift of modern life. The Enlightenment had dethroned God, but had kept the Christian morality, assuming that human reason and compassion could provide a new foundation. Nietzsche thought this was a delusion. He saw that people were still going to church, still using moral language, still acting as if there were objective values, but they no longer really believed in the power behind the words. They were living on the fumes of a dead faith. The madman continues. "How," the madman asks, "did we manage to drink the ocean dry? Who handed us the sponge that erased the horizon? What were we up to the day we cut the earth loose from its sun? Where is the planet falling now, away from every star? Are we tumbling, backward, sideways, every direction at once? Is there an up anymore, a down? Are we just wandering through some endless nothing?" This is the existential condition in its starkest form. With God dead, the horizon has been wiped away. There is no up or down, no fixed point of reference. We are adrift in an infinite nothing. The consequence, Nietzsche predicted, would be the arrival of nihilism, the belief in nothing. If there is no ultimate truth, no divine plan, no cosmic meaning, then everything is permitted. Values are just human inventions, masks for the will to power. The highest values devalue themselves, and Nietzsche saw this nihilism coming like a shadow that would cover Europe for the next 2 centuries. He called himself the first perfect nihilist of Europe, but he also said he had lived through nihilism and emerged on the other side. Nietzsche did not want us to stay in the valley of nihilism. He saw it as a necessary demolition project. The old structures of meaning had to be torn down before anything new could be built. And he imagined a future figure, a new kind of human being, who could create meaning in the absence of God. He called this figure the Übermensch. The word is notoriously difficult to translate. Superman is the most common rendering, but it carries comic book connotations that Nietzsche would have despised. Overman is better. Self-overcomer captures something essential. The Übermensch is not a blonde beast, a fascist dictator, a master of slaves. The Übermensch is the person who, staring into the void of a meaningless universe, does not collapse in despair. Instead, they stand up and say, "Good. If there is no pre-written meaning, then I will create my own." Nietzsche offers a famous thought experiment to test whether you are on the path to the Übermensch. It is the idea of the eternal return. Imagine, he says, that a demon crept into your loneliest loneliness and said to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence." If this thought were true, how would you respond? Would you gnash your teeth and curse the demon? Or would you say, "You are a god and I have never heard anything more divine"? To be able to say yes to life, to affirm it so completely that you would will its eternal repetition, every agonizing moment of it, this, for Nietzsche, is the highest affirmation. This is amor fati, the love of fate. "My formula for greatness in a human being," he wrote, "is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it, but love it." This is an ethic of creation, not obedience. For Nietzsche, life is not a problem to be solved, but a work of art to be created. We are the artists of our own existence, and the material we have to work with is the raw, often brutal, often beautiful stuff of our actual lives, our bodies, our histories, our desires, our suffering. The task is to give style to our character, to shape ourselves into something coherent and noble, not by following a pre-existing template, but by imposing our own will, our own taste, our own law. Nietzsche's own life was a tragic testament to the difficulty of this path. He was a lonely, physically suffering man, plagued by migraines, digestive problems, and failing eyesight. He never found the audience he craved in his lifetime. His brief, intense friendship with the composer Richard Wagner ended in bitter estrangement. His proposal to the brilliant young woman Lou Salome was rejected, and in 1889, at the age of 44, he collapsed in the streets of Turin, weeping and embracing a horse that was being whipped by its driver. He spent the last 11 years of his life in a state of mental and physical collapse, cared for by his sister, who would later twist his legacy into a grotesque parody that served the Nazi ideology he would have loathed. And yet, the work remains, the questions remain, the challenge remains. Can you say yes to your life? Can you create your own values? Can you live without the crutch of a pre-given meaning? The Russian Soul, Dostoevsky's Underground, and the Problem of Freedom. While Nietzsche was writing in German, a Russian novelist was exploring the same dark territories in fiction. Fyodor Dostoevsky never called himself an existentialist. The word did not exist, but his novels are among the most profound existential documents ever written. He took the abstract questions of freedom, faith, and meaning, and made them bleed on the page. His novella Notes from Underground, published in 1864, is a foundational text. The narrator is a retired civil servant living in a squalid corner of St. Petersburg. He is bitter, spiteful, self-loathing, and fiercely intelligent, and he is writing his notes as an act of defiance against the dominant philosophy of his day, a kind of rational egoism and utopian socialism that claimed that if you could just arrange society correctly, eliminate poverty and ignorance, and show people where their true interests lay, they would naturally act in their own best interest, and everyone would be happy. The underground man disagrees. He argues that human beings are not rational, calculating machines. They are perverse, contradictory, and deeply attached to their own freedom, even when that freedom leads to suffering. He imagines a perfectly rational society, a crystal palace where every need is met and every action is optimized for happiness. And he says that if such a palace were built, he would want to stick his tongue out at it. He would want to smash it, just to prove that he is not a piano key, not a cog in a machine, but a free human being. Man, whoever he might be, has always and everywhere liked to act as he wants, and not at all as reason and advantage dictate, he writes. And he might want something that is against his own advantage, and sometimes he positively must. He continues, one's own free and voluntary wanting, one's own caprice, however wild, one's own fancy, though chafed sometimes to the point of madness. This is that same most advantageous advantage, the one that is omitted, which does not fit into any classification, and because of which all systems and theories are constantly blown to the devil. This is a profound insight. The underground man is showing us that freedom is not just the ability to choose the good and the rational, it is also the ability to choose the bad, the self-destructive, the irrational, simply because it is my choice. This is the dark side of the existential freedom that Sartre would later celebrate. It is the freedom that can lead to ruin as easily as to greatness. Dostoevsky's later novels explore this theme on a grander scale. In Crime and Punishment, the student Raskolnikov commits a murder to prove to himself that he is a Napoleon, a great man who stands beyond conventional morality. He discovers, to his horror, that he is not. His conscience, his human connection to others, cannot be silenced. He is not a Superman. He is a suffering human being who needs redemption. In The Brothers Karamazov, the character Ivan Karamazov delivers a devastating indictment of God, citing the suffering of innocent children. It's not that I don't accept God, Ivan says. I just most respectfully return him the ticket. This is the problem of evil rendered as an existential crisis. And his famous line, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted," echoes through the work of Sartre and Camus. But Dostoevsky also offers a path forward. His novels are filled with characters who find meaning not in grand theories or heroic defiance, but in humble, active love. In The Brothers Karamazov, the saintly elder Zosima teaches that love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. The way out of the underground, for Dostoevsky, is not through more thinking, but through more loving, through the concrete, difficult, daily work of caring for the person in front of you. The Age of Anxiety, Heidegger, Sartre, and the French café. The 20th century arrived with a bang, specifically the bang of artillery shells on the Western Front, the hum of assembly lines in industrial cities, and later, the unimaginable horror of the concentration camp ovens. The First World War shattered the last vestiges of Victorian optimism and the belief in inevitable progress. Suddenly, the talk of dread, alienation, the absurd, and being towards death wasn't just philosophy. It was the daily news. It was the texture of life for millions. In Germany, in the years between the wars, a philosopher named Martin Heidegger gave the movement its dense, poetic, and notoriously difficult vocabulary. His masterwork, Being and Time, published in 1927, is a book that even professional philosophers find challenging. It is written in a language that Heidegger had to invent, full of hyphenated compounds and strange neologisms. But at its core, it is asking a very simple question. What does it mean to be? Heidegger's starting point is that philosophy, since Plato, had made a massive mistake. It had focused on beings, the things that exist, like chairs, atoms, ideas, gods, and had forgotten the question of being itself. What is the background, the horizon, the condition that allows anything to show up as something at all? To get at this question, Heidegger begins with the being that asks the question, the human being. But he refuses to use the word human. He calls us Dasein, which is ordinary German for existence, but which Heidegger breaks down into its components, da, there, and sein, being. We are being there. We are not a soul trapped in a body, not a mind observing a world from a distance. We are always already there, in the midst of things, engaged with a world that matters to us, and we find ourselves thrown into this world. We did not choose to be born. We did not choose our parents, our historical moment, our language, our culture, our body. We simply find ourselves here, already underway, already burdened with a past we cannot change. This is thrownness. But we are not just passive products of our circumstances. We are also always projecting ourselves into the future. We are oriented toward possibilities. We are always on the way to something, planning, hoping, fearing, becoming. This is projection. And because we are thrown projection, we are always in a state of fallenness. We tend to drift away from our own authentic possibilities and lose ourselves in the they, das Man, the anonymous crowd. We do what one does. We think what one thinks. We talk like one talks. We let the anonymous mass of public opinion dictate our choices, and in doing so, we flee from the burden of being a self. But there is something that can jolt us out of this fallenness, this everyday drifting, and that is the awareness of our own death. Heidegger says we are always being towards death. This does not mean we are morbid or obsessed with dying. It means that the awareness of our own inevitable, non-negotiable end is what gives life its urgency and its potential for authenticity. Death, for Heidegger, is not just an event that will happen someday in the distant future. It is a possibility that is with us at every moment. It is the possibility of the impossibility of any further possibilities. It is the end of my world, and no one can die my death for me. It is the most individualizing, the most mine of all possibilities. When I truly face the reality that I will die, that my time is finite, that I cannot take refuge in the indefinite, one dies someday, something shifts. The claims of the they lose their power. I realize that I have to choose now what kind of life I will live. I have to take responsibility for my own existence. This is what Heidegger calls anticipatory resoluteness, the decision to live in the light of your own finitude, to own your thrownness and your possibilities, to be authentically yourself. Heidegger's philosophy is a powerful description of the human condition, but it is also, famously, a politically compromised one. In 1933, he joined the Nazi Party and became the rector of Freiburg University, delivering speeches that aligned his philosophy with the rhetoric of National Socialism. He resigned the rectorship after less than a year, and his relationship to the regime remains a subject of intense debate and condemnation. The question of whether his philosophy is inherently fascist or whether his personal choices were a betrayal of his own best insights is one that continues to haunt his legacy. But the power of his analysis of Dasein, thrownness, and being towards death remains undeniable. And then came the French. After the Nazi occupation of Paris, after the collaboration and the resistance, after the liberation, a new kind of hero emerged in the smoky cafés of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Jean-Paul Sartre. He took Heidegger's heavy Germanic language and electrified it into a slogan that would capture the imagination of a generation: existence precedes essence. This is the central dogma of atheistic existentialism. To understand it, think of a paper knife. Before the paper knife exists, there is an idea of it in the mind of the craftsman. He knows what it is for, cutting paper. He designs it according to that purpose. The essence of the paper knife, what it is, precedes its existence, that it is. For centuries, Western thought assumed that humans were like that paper knife. God, the divine craftsman, had an idea of human nature before he created Adam. We were made for a purpose. Our essence preceded our existence. Sartre said, "No, there is no divine craftsman. We just show up. We are born. we find ourselves existing, and only then, through our actions and choices, do we define who we are. There is no fixed human nature. There is no predetermined purpose. We are nothing else but what we do. This is a terrifyingly radical freedom. As Sartre put it, man is condemned to be free, condemned because he did not choose to exist, yet once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. We cannot blame our genetics. We cannot blame our upbringing. We cannot blame our social class or our horoscope or the influence of our friends. We are the sum of our actions. Every choice we make is a choice for all of humanity, because in choosing, we are implicitly saying, this is what a human being should do. This is an enormous burden, and because it is so heavy, we constantly try to flee from it. Sartre calls this flight bad faith, mauvaise foi. Bad faith is the attempt to pretend that we are not free, that we are just a thing determined by circumstances. Sartre gives a famous example. Imagine a waiter in a Parisian café. He moves with a kind of mechanical precision. He balances his tray with a little too much care. He bows with a little too much deference. He is playing the role of waiter so perfectly, so completely, that he seems to disappear into the role. He is trying to convince himself, and you, that he is just a waiter, a cog in a machine, a thing with a fixed essence. But he is not a thing. He is a free human being who, every morning, chooses to get up and be a waiter. He could walk out the door and join the circus. He could refuse to serve the rude customer. The fact that he does not is his choice. To pretend it is not a choice is bad faith. Another example Sartre gives is a woman on a first date. The man takes her hand. She knows that if she leaves her hand in his, she is consenting to a certain kind of intimacy, a certain direction for the evening. But she does not want to face that choice. So she leaves her hand there, limp and unresponsive, pretending it is just a thing, a piece of meat, not a hand that belongs to a free, choosing person. She is in bad faith. Sartre's partner in life and thought, Simone de Beauvoir, applied this existential framework to the condition of women in her groundbreaking 1949 book, The Second Sex. Her famous opening line, "One is not born but rather becomes a woman," is pure existentialism. There is no eternal feminine essence that dictates you must be nurturing, passive, emotional, or domestic. These are social constructs, roles that have been imposed on women by a patriarchal society. Women have been defined as the other, the object to man's subject. The task of the woman who would be free is to reject this imposed definition and to define herself through her own projects, her own choices, her own transcendence. De Beauvoir's work was a foundational text for second-wave feminism, and it remains a powerful demonstration of how existentialist ideas can illuminate the concrete, political realities of oppression. The Gentle Rebel, Camus, and the Smile of Sisyphus. Sitting slightly apart from Sartre, both personally and philosophically, was Albert Camus. Born in Algeria to a poor working-class family, his mother was deaf and illiterate, his father killed in the First World War when Albert was an infant. Camus knew hardship from the inside. He was a journalist, a member of the French resistance during the occupation, a novelist, a playwright, and a man of immense, weathered charm. He was less interested in the heavy philosophical system of being and nothingness, and more interested in the simple, brutal, undeniable feeling that life does not make sense. He called this confrontation the absurd. The absurd is not a property of the world is not absurd. It is simply silent, indifferent, there. And the absurd is not a property of the human mind. We are not absurd. We are longing, questioning, hoping creatures. The absurd is the relationship between the two. It is the divorce between our human cry for clarity, for meaning, for a reason why, and the universe's unreasoning silence. In his long essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942 in the middle of the war, Camus asks what he calls the only truly serious philosophical question: why shouldn't I just kill myself? If life is meaningless, if the absurd is our condition, if there is no hope of a resolution, Why keep playing the game? Why not just check out? He examines various answers. There is physical suicide, which he rejects as an escape, not a solution. It removes the questioner, but not the question. There is philosophical suicide, which is the leap of faith, Kierkegaard's leap, or the Marxist leap of faith in history, or any system that denies the absurd by claiming to have found the ultimate answer. Camus rejects this too. It is an evasion, a betrayal of the lucidity that the absurd demands. We must keep the tension alive. We must not resolve the paradox. So what is left? Revolt. Not a political revolution, though Camus was involved in resistance, but an inner stance of defiance. To live in revolt is to keep the absurd alive, to look at the universe and say, I want meaning, and you will not give it to me. But I will go on living anyway. I will not surrender my desire for clarity, and I will not pretend you have satisfied it. And to illustrate this revolt, Camus turns to an ancient Greek myth. Sisyphus was a king of Corinth, a clever and deceitful man who managed to cheat death not once but twice. For his hubris, the gods condemned him to an eternal punishment. He must push a giant boulder up a steep hill. As soon as he reaches the summit, the boulder rolls back down, and he must begin again, forever. This, Camus says, is a portrait of the modern worker. Wake up, commute, work, eat, sleep, repeat. Day after day, year after year, the same pointless, exhausting, absurd routine. The rock rolls down. We push it up again. We are all Sisyphus. But here is the twist, the turn that makes Camus's essay one of the most life-affirming documents of the 20th century. He asks us to imagine Sisyphus pausing at the top of the hill, just for a second, as he watches that rock tumble back down into the valley. And then imagine him turning around and walking back down to begin again. In that moment, Sisyphus is conscious. He knows his fate. He knows it is absurd. He knows it will never end, but he owns it. The rock is his thing. The struggle is his. The gods thought they were punishing him with meaningless labor. But Sisyphus, in his consciousness, his lucidity, his refusal to hope for a different fate, transforms the punishment into a kind of victory. He is stronger than his rock. He despises his fate enough to endure it, and in enduring it, he finds a strange kind of happiness. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, Camus writes. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This is not a delusion. It is not a comfortable, optimistic lie. It is a bracing, clear-eyed, and deeply courageous stance. It is the decision to love a life that does not love you back. It is the courage to dive into the icy water of the present moment precisely because there is no warm bath waiting for us in the afterlife. It is the affirmation of the here and now, the bread and the wine, the sun on the skin, the salt of the sea, the face of a friend, all of it more precious because it is fleeting, all of it more real because it is all we have. Camus developed these themes in his novels. The Stranger tells the story of Meursault, a man who seems incapable of feeling the appropriate emotions. He does not cry at his mother's funeral. He kills a man on the beach for no clear reason, and who is condemned by society as much for his emotional strangeness as for his crime. At the end, facing execution, Meursault opens himself to the tender indifference of the world and feels a kind of peace. The plague is an allegory of the Nazi occupation, but it is also a profound meditation on solidarity in the face of an absurd catastrophe. When the plague strikes the town of Oran, the citizens have a choice: despair, flee, or fight. The hero, Dr. Ryu, simply does his job. He tends the sick. He does not know if he is making a difference. He does not know if it matters, but he does it anyway. There is no question of heroism in all this, he says. It's a matter of common decency. This is existentialism in action, not a grand gesture, but the quiet, persistent choice to care. The legacy. Existentialism beyond the café. The existentialist moment in Paris faded. Sartre and Camus had a bitter public falling out over politics. Camus rejected the revolutionary violence that Sartre for a time defended. New intellectual fashions arrived: structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction. The cafés of Saint-Germain filled with new debates about language, power, and the death of the author. But the existentialist questions did not go away. They cannot go away because they are woven into the fabric of being human. Every generation rediscovers them in its own way. In the 1950s and 60s, the Beat Generation writers, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, channeled an existential restlessness into their road trips, their poetry, their experiments with drugs and spirituality. They were searching for an authentic experience, a way out of the bad faith of suburban consumer America. In the 1960s and 70s, the human potential movement and existential psychotherapy, pioneered by figures like Rollo May, Irvin Yalom, and Viktor Frankl, brought existential themes into the therapist's office. Frankl, a survivor of the Nazi concentration camps, wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that even in the most dehumanizing conditions imaginable, a person can find meaning. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, he wrote, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. This is Stoicism and existentialism fused in the crucible of the camps. In literature, the existential sensibility continued to thrive. Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot, presents two tramps, Vladimir and Estragon, waiting by a tree for someone named Godot, who never arrives. They fill the time with banter, with routines, with half-remembered stories. "Let's go," they say. "We can't," they reply. "Why not?" "We're waiting for Godot." The play is a distillation of the absurd. We are waiting for a meaning that never shows up, and we fill the waiting with whatever we can. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, existential themes have surfaced in popular culture in ways that the philosophers of the café might not have anticipated. The films of Ingmar Bergman, The Seventh Seal, Persona, Wild Strawberries, are suffused with existential dread and the search for meaning in a silent universe. The novels of Milan Kundera, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, explore the weight and lightness of our choices. The Coen brothers' film A Serious Man is a modern retelling of the Book of Job, filtered through the lens of suburban Jewish angst. The television show The Good Place is, at its heart, a long, hilarious, and surprisingly rigorous exploration of what it means to be a good person in a universe that does not offer clear moral rules. And in our own moment, an age of climate anxiety, political instability, algorithmic alienation, and a pervasive sense that the old certainties are crumbling, the existentialist questions feel more urgent than ever. We are bombarded with information, connected by technology, and yet many people report feeling lonelier, more adrift, more uncertain of who they are and what they are supposed to do. The they that Heidegger warned about is now a global digital network, and its voice is louder than ever. What existentialism offers? No answers, but a path. So, after this long walk through 4,000 years of human questioning, what have we found? Existentialism does not offer a prescription for happiness. It is not a self-help book with 7 easy steps to a meaningful life. It is, in many ways, a diagnosis of a chronic condition, the condition of being a self-aware animal on a spinning rock in the middle of a vast, silent cosmos. But in that diagnosis, there is a strange and powerful liberation. It tells us that the anxiety we feel about death and meaning is not a malfunction of our brain. It is not a sign that we are broken or that we have failed to read the right book or follow the right guru. It is the price of consciousness. It is the sign that we are awake. It tells us that if we are lonely in our freedom, we are also the only ones holding the pen. We do not get to choose the stage, the props, or the length of the scene, but we get to choose how we deliver our lines. We get to choose what kind of character we will play. And it tells us, perhaps most importantly, that the small things matter. Gilgamesh, at the end of his quest, looked at the walls of his city and found a fragile, human-sized meaning in the work of his hands. Qohelet, after cataloging the vapor of all striving, counseled us to eat our bread with joy and drink our wine with a merry heart. Camus, staring into the absurd, asked us to imagine Sisyphus happy, finding his fulfillment in the struggle itself, in the weight of the rock and the warmth of the sun. The existentialists do not agree on everything. Kierkegaard took a leap of faith. Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God and called us to become creators. Sartre insisted on our radical freedom and responsibility. Camus embraced the absurd and found solidarity in revolt. But they all point us toward the same truth. You are here. You are alive. What will you do with it? There is a passage in Sartre's essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, that captures this call with a kind of bracing clarity. He tells the story of a young man who came to him during the war, torn between two duties. He wanted to stay with his mother, who was dependent on him and would be devastated by his absence. But he also wanted to join the Free French forces and fight against the Nazi occupation. He asked Sartre what he should do. Sartre's answer was simple. You are free. Choose. No general ethic can tell you what to do. There are no omens. You must invent your own law. The young man had to make a choice, and in making it, he would define not only his own life, but also, in a small way, what it means to be human. This is the weight we all carry. This is the freedom we all share. And this is the invitation that existentialism extends to each of us across the millennia, from the clay tablets of Uruk to the glowing screens of our own uncertain age. So, the next time you find yourself standing at the edge of that dark forest, without a map and without a compass, remember that you are not lost. You are just awake. Remember that Gilgamesh wept for his friend and then built his walls. Remember that Qohelet saw the vapor and still praised the bread and the wine. Remember that Sisyphus, at the top of his hill, watching the rock tumble down, found a reason to turn around and walk back. And remember that the only way out is to take that first step, not because you know where it leads, but because the walking is the only way to find out who it is that's doing the walking. The path is made by walking. The self is made by choosing. And the meaning, if there is any to be found, is made in the living of it, one breath, one choice, one small, absurd, beautiful moment at a time. We've reached the end. Thank you for listening all the way through. This was The History of Existentialism, presented by Steve Buttercup III. If you enjoyed the essay, a like or subscribe helps greatly, and if there was a particular story, figure, or moment that stood out to you, feel free to leave a comment. I'm also putting together more long-form audiobooks and historical essays that will be released on Spotify over the next few months. If you're a Spotify Premium member, you can listen there for free, and if you choose to support the work directly, it's appreciated. If the questions in this essay stayed with you, meaning mortality, freedom, how to live without a map, you can find more of that on X, formerly Twitter, where I post maxims, fragments from the philosophers, and notes on history that pick up where essays like this leave off. Thanks again for listening.